article. I read it yesterday and I thought, sure, there's a lot in there. I don't know. It was more questions than answers, I think. But yeah, hopefully will spark some discussion. And I think it really aligns with a lot of what we've been trying to grapple with recently around what are we actually doing with interviews and really going deep into interviews. So yeah, looking forward to it. So I'll hand over to you, Siobhan. Thank you.
Should I unmute or my sound will go through your?
Maybe just do it through mine. Yeah. No, it's perfect. You want to share slides, Rona?
Yeah, great. Okay, so I found this paper quite challenging in some ways because like it challenged a lot of the ways that I think about interviews and the ways that I've been doing transcription. And some of the things I have to say, like I didn't fully agree with everything that he presented. And I think some of it is maybe contextual, and I think something I come back to a lot is that it depends on your research question and what you're actually doing. But there are some things that he raises that I think could be really useful. Yeah, so I think the first question that he asked, or the first really important question that he asked was, what can we actually know from interviews? What can they actually tell us? What information can they give us? And he says that we kind of assume that they can elicit experiences or perceptions, but that assumes a link between language that somebody uses and their psychic state. And I'm just going to use these like bubbles like this to illustrate some of the thoughts that I was having so these red bubbles are my thoughts. So the thought that I had with this was that he sounds mistrustful of other people's ability to self-represent. And from a counseling background, we assume that when people are talking about their experience, they are representing themselves with some degree of accuracy, whether or not they have insight to something else, but that they are representing their experiential reality. But then he also makes the point that we elevate the experiential as authentic. And I think, for me, when I'm looking at experiences of caregiving, experience is what's important. So that's where I think, like, I disagree with him about it depends on your research question. So like in palliative care, where you're not necessarily looking at like an outcome of like prolonging someone's life, or like with quantitative medicine, you're looking at how many years have you added to someone's life. Whereas in palliative care, I think the experience of care is more important than prolonging someone's life necessarily. In which case, you do actually want someone's experience, and that is authentically what you're looking at. But again, it depends on like what your research question is.
Yeah, I got the feeling that his major complaint is about people saying, well, I'm looking at experiences, but actually it's so superficial and it's just like it's not actually looking at experiences. And I think that was his major complaint.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought what he was saying about the psychic state was very interesting, and I absolutely agree with what you're saying here, that coming from a counseling background, one might have a different perspective on things, definitely.
I think, and I say, like, I have in my conclusions that maybe I missed his point a little bit. But yeah, like, it's helpful to hear that about that maybe he's talking about people like not delving into it very deeply. It seemed to me like, and he does say later in the paper, he's not saying that we shouldn't look at experiences at all, but that, yeah, like it kind of, I guess for me, I'm looking at experiences. So I was like, okay, so he's like questioning the fact that we can look at experiences at all in interviews. And I was like, I think that we can. I do think that we can.
But I think his issue is about the depth of, can you actually ever really get to somebody's true experience?
Yes, yeah.
I see Charmaine has a hand up. Go for it, Charmaine.
Hi, sorry, there's a lot of noise in the background. Unfortunately, my neighbor's blowing leaves around. But
we can't hear a thing.
Oh, I'm so glad you can't, because it's so annoying. But yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I think that interviews can elicit experiences or perceptions, but I also thought that he was talking about how if it's too superficial, that we may not be eliciting the experiences in enough depth. So, I mean, I've seen with some of my qualitative interviews that were maybe not done as well as I would have liked by interviewers, that they didn't explore what the patient or the participant was saying. So sometimes they would say something which would be their experience, but it was quite superficial. And so I don't know, I thought that maybe he was also talking about like how deep our interviews are and whether they are true experiences when you've just got one or two sentences describing that person's experience.
That to me, like that then relates to probing and the probing of the interviewer. And I think, like that is, I think the part that I really enjoyed about this paper was where he kind of gives ideas of how to improve quality. And he doesn't actually mention probing, but we'll get there. I'm going to go.
Could I also just say, that in internal and external, William Boyd, he's an author, and he's also a historian. He says we make the mistake that we think that history is events plus time, and it never is. And I think that this is also the point that's coming through here, is that experiences are not pure. That even your own experience, it's not factual. You are putting your own spin on things, and I think it also changes depending on how you're feeling, and that also is something that is difficult to quantify. And what is validity then? Because is it because you're feeling particularly positive or negative will color how you remember your experience.
Absolutely. And I think he was also talking about people's readiness to share their experiences. So, okay, let's sit down, and now we're talking about your experience, and it's not a neatly packaged thing that you could just access. You're reflecting on it, and as you say, Rona, it's a fluid thing to reflect on experience. It's going to change with time. And as you experience something even more. So, say you want to ask about experiences of caring for a child with a disability, for example, it's going to be a very different experience 5 years down the line, even 2 years, even 6 months down the line. And I think that's also what he was saying, that it's not this neatly packaged thing that we're going to access and sit the person down and say, right, tell me now.
And it's unchanging.
So just continuing on this theme of what can we actually know, and he has this quote which I really liked. Meaning is not merely directly elicited by skillful questioning, nor is it simply transported through truthful replies. It is strategically assembled through the interview process. And I agree with that. It's, there's a quote that I use again later from these same guys, Holstein and Gubrium, about how it's created. It's like this co-created narrative that happens through the interviewer and the participant and the conversation that we're having together. And that even then in the transcription process and the analysis process, that's also part of the way that we construct this meaning, we construct this narrative. But he then also says we treat the interviewee as though they're in a special epistemic position with respect to their own conduct. And again, like from a counseling perspective, I disagree with that, because this is my thought again. We are assuming that the participant has insight into their own behavior, which is not always true, but it feels from an ethical perspective a bit patronizing to assume that somebody doesn't have insight into their behavior. So like kind of walk in and say, okay, well, they don't really know what's going on in their own lives, So that I think I had difficulty with when I read that. I was like, I don't know, like they do have a special epistemic position with respect to their own conduct. There may be different people who have different perspectives on their conduct as well. And again, like that comes back to truth, like what is true, but that's still their experience, and their experience is still a special epistemic position, I think.
But I think it's also about the positionality with which you see yourself in relation to the research participants. So do you see them as something of an expert from whom you can learn and gain knowledge?
Well,
or do you see them
their own lives?
Exactly. And do you perceive them and position them in that way in the research or not? And that's going to give a different spin, I think, on how the interview plays out.
And that insider-outsider talks about the researcher actually having to understand the story better than the storyteller. So they do talk about, if you're going to take that external, is to add some meaning and value to the experience.
That's why it's so important to almost sort of state your stance. right at the beginning of every research project or how you choose to analyze things.
Yeah.
I'm coming from this background, and
Mhm.
this is my experience, and this is how sort of this might play a part in how I see
Why make
just the
sense?
of how it makes sense to me.
The reflexivity.
Yeah. But maybe taking it further, so stating your own position, but also really considering how you view the research participants.
Yes.
So are they, and that's a whole nother discussion for another day, but there's a lot that's been talked about recently with things like co-design. So actually getting participants to co-design a study,
Yeah.
to collaborate with you. And that's very different from the sort of patronizing, paternalistic, I'm the researcher who knows everything and I'm going in to learn,
To help.
to help these people or to see what they think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that positionality is so key. It's very interesting how all these different
Yes.
deep dives we've been doing over the last year or so are all connecting.
Yeah.
So then he makes a suggestion that we can rephrase interview questions to focus on social processes or behaviors rather than trying to understand someone's individual state of mind. And that was, for me, I think I think I understood that to be like the main argument that he was making, that it rather than trying to understand someone's experience in an interview, like their perceptions and their experience and their feelings, but rather to understand how social processes have impacted what they've done and what has happened, which I thought was very interesting.
And I think it ties in. I like the way he brought in the ethnomethodological perspective, the CA, the conversation analysis, saying it's co-constructed.
Yes, yes.
So, because often I think we think of interactional research as very separate from interview research. And actually what he was saying was they're quite similar in terms of it's talk that's co-constructed. So the meaning and the reflection on experiences, whatever you want to call it, as that process that's happening in the interview is co-constructed.
Yeah. Okay, so the next section, he kind of talks about the intellectual auspices of the argument that he's making for looking at sociological things, which I got annoyed, and I was like, I thought of it as the section in which the author argues about who thinks what about what who said. And he says some people are interpreting so-and-so like this, but he disagrees and whatever. And he does the same thing, right? He presents intellectual auspices for his argument, which is, I think, something that we do in academia. But he refers to Weber and Mills and this idea that they present of connecting motivation to sociological processes where actions have consequences. So when I do this, then this and this and this happens. And this is why I did this and this and this. Because, in this action, in this social context, this happened. Like in a healthcare setting, this doctor didn't help me, so I went to somebody else to get a second opinion, or I went to a traditional healer because that felt more culturally appropriate. There are sociological processes that are causing people to take action. And I think that's a really good point. But he then also critiques the use of intellectual ancestors too. I thought this was so harsh to add a theoretical varnish to pedestrian research.
Yeah, he's quite very, very, but he's coming from David Silverman is a real guru in qualitative research. So he's coming from a position of really understanding the methodology. Yes.
He could just as I'm not saying that his research studies are pedestrian, but it's like we do take theory to like kind of situate what we're doing, and we say, okay, well, we're using this framework that was presented by so and so.
Although I get what he's saying, and I think a lot of the time we kowtow to journal editors and reviewers who say, where's the theory? And then we just slap in some theory, any theory. It's a bit like, I hate to say it, but even with our postgrad proposals, they have to put theory in. And then you're kind of scrambling for theory, because typically with qualitative research, certainly the way that we do it, you don't superimpose a theory onto what you're doing. It's exploratory. And then as you go along, you might come across theories that might help you to explain and understand from a bottom-up
and
approach.
it's not quite grounded theory either, because then then
that's a whole
grounded theory, and then it's not that.
No, because you're not creating a theory unless you set out to do that and you're using grounded theory.
But you can't, So it is
Yeah.
difficult to, like you say, I also think that's quite harsh.
Yeah, but I get what he's saying, because I think a lot of people fall into that trap, that they just slap in any old theory, and
Yeah.
it's often to satisfy an editor or a reviewer.
I guess it
Mm.
comes like what you said right at the beginning about like the depth or the shallowness.
Yeah.
And that like if
Yeah.
it's like you're very shallowly engaging with the thing, but you've just slapped the theory on, it's one thing.
Mm.
But yeah, like I guess like I didn't have that perspective when reading this as somebody who's like quite new to qualitative. It was just like, this is a really harsh thing to say. Wow.
Yeah, no, it is. And I mean, to call out other people and say, talk about their studies as pedestrian, that's quite harsh, but it's true, unfortunately, because there is a lot of rubbish and a lot of superficial stuff out there. And, you know, as a researcher with a bit of experience, I know some of the stuff that I produced early on probably fell into that category. You know, and again, it does depend on what you were saying earlier, Siobhan, that it depends on the research question and what you're asking and the phenomenon that you're trying to get to.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's quite superficial and descriptive, and other times you're going right deep into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I put in a point here, which is from my own reading. Like I'm really interested in Buddhist philosophy, and I think of that also as an intellectual framework sometimes, or a framework in which to like view experience or view the world. And in Buddhist philosophy, we see the mind as this vast and difficult thing to know, but it's not impossible to know. I think coming back to this question of whether participants have insight into their own behavior, the whole basis of like mindfulness practices, which, you know, also there's a whole lot of research on those things, is that you can actually, people are capable of self-reflection and insight. And so like, I think I go in with that belief, you know, and I enter in that's a kind of an intellectual framework that I'm entering into my research with, is that I do believe that people are capable of knowing about their own experience and self-representing and having insight. Yeah, and I'm reluctant, I think, to let that go. Like
And that's okay. I think it's also then about how does the interviewer get that participant to the point where they're able to unpack.
Yeah.
So, and I think he talks about that later, that it's about the craft and the art of how you're asking and how you're doing the interview.
Yes.
And that's, I think, what's important. So I don't think you're wrong here. And I think it's good to actually identify your own stance and your positionality.
You can't do an interview if you don't believe that.
Well, that's
because then what's the point?
Yeah.
Because then you don't trust your data before you've even collected it.
And you don't trust the qualitative paradigm, full stop. You might as well just go back to quantitative research in a lab. Yes.
Because numbers don't lie. We all know that.
But that's kind of how I felt like reading this. I was like, but then, you know, and he does say later in the paper, like he's not advocating that we don't do interview research and whatever. But I think he's maybe asking us to look at how we frame things and to do things in a more detailed way, and maybe using conversation analysis techniques. Like that was a lot of what he was describing. I was like, this sounds like conversation. I don't think he ever said that directly.
No, he talks about ethnomethodology, which is close enough, I guess.
Okay. So yeah, so then this was the part like where he gives like his tips, I guess, or his ideas for how to improve interview data. And firstly, the improvement of interview questions. And he suggests focusing on behaviors rather than experiences. And he says using how or what questions, though I think you could still ask, how are you feeling? Or how did that make you feel? Whereas my understanding of what he was trying to say was like to ask maybe what happened, what did you do, what did other people do to it, how did other people respond to that? If we're talking about behavior and sociological experience, I think that's what he was suggesting.
Yeah, I think he wants to go deeper than just the descriptive, so a description of the behavior, but actually getting at the how and the what, and understanding the how behavior works and what do people do.
But then I don't think that I fully understood how to frame questions around that.
I felt like he could have given a little bit more information about that.
Okay.
I also think like, sorry, did I catch your name?
So
Charmaine, go for it.
I mean, where does the why come in here? So I mean, you're
Exactly.
asking, what did you do? You know, you do next and all that, and how did that work? But is there any why in the process? I mean, I understand behaviors, but is there not reasons why people behaved in the way they did?
Well,
Reflection.
Well, that's the thing. I think when you ask somebody, why did you do this? You're assuming they have insight into the reasons for their behavior. I think that's the thing that sits with me, or the point that I'm making, is that if you ask someone directly, why did you do this? Why did this happen? You're assuming that they can tell you truthfully and that they have insight into what their motivation was for doing that thing, which I do. I assume that they're going to tell me why they did it. Whereas I think he's questioning that, or that was my understanding of this paper, was that he's questioning that you can actually get to that, or that, that people can represent that accurately. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, Charmaine, is the why.
Yeah.
Is part of that.
And it might not show insight. I mean, they could say, I did it because I was angry and he did this and that. And actually, they're not maybe understanding how their behavior is maybe, I don't know, not what would be expected or something. So I think it either shows insight or it shows no insight. So I think it could answer both questions possibly.
So that's something we could add here, is getting at the how and the what and the why.
Yeah,
depending on your research question. Yeah. Megan,
Yeah,
did you want to?
Yeah, I think sort of to add to that point, because that, often it's kind of not just taking someone's comments sort of at surface level. It's kind of part of the interview, or part of your analysis is kind of delving under understanding and discussing and kind of thinking about why, why did that response happen? And then I also think you can't just look at someone's comments or their feedback in an interview that it's in a vacuum. You have to look at context, and you have to look at sort of broader social, institutionalized sort of settings. You can't just look at someone's interview just in that vacuum, in that room.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So sometimes I have a problem with conversation analysis, is that, like, yes, there's this process that's happening in the interview, but you have to understand the broader context as well.
So one of the points from CA, and he said it in a different way, I'd have to dig it out in the article, but CA people would say, why this now? So why is someone saying this now in the interaction? But I agree, Megan, it's good to then think about why this now in the broader context of their life.
Part of the research is that you do delve into sort of a deeper level of interpretation and understanding.
Yeah,
you're not recording. Research isn't a recording. It's an interpretation. There's got to be some kind of added element.
Sure.
Yeah, so he with the interview questions, he's suggesting that we phrase things to focus on social processes rather than states of mind. And I think this is where, I think I would agree with you, Jenny, that he could have given a bit more like informational pointers about how to actually do that.
And what that looks like. Yes.
And then he talks about improving transcriptions as well. And then another quote from Holstein and Gubrium, narratives resulting from interviews are interactional accomplishments, which I also agree with. I think,
Sorry, connectivity. We're back.
Yeah, I'm just moving and see.
It's us, not you. Sorry.
No problem.
That's where the planning comes in, I think, as an interview, sort of with an interview, is that you have to think of all these things. Like, is the person going to be the most comfortable in the language you're going to conduct it in? Are you a really young woman speaking to a much older man?
Yes.
There are lots of social things and sort of planning and prepping, I think, that goes into the interview as well, right? Just what is talked about.
But sometimes it also happens in, like, I think I know with, the interviews that Sister Kiletso and I have done, you kind of look back on it afterwards and go, okay, well, this could have been better if Sister Kiletso was there, or it could have been better if I was there, or, Sister Kiletso did an interview alone, and what she got out of it, I'm like, I don't know if that would have been said if I was in the room, and it's difficult sometimes to anticipate what somebody will be willing to share with a different person. Like I think we do have these maybe stereotypes or ideas, these generalizations, and I think they are useful, like like a young woman and an older man or whatever. But then like it can also be very surprising what comes out. So it feels difficult to anticipate all of that. But I guess that's also part of the research is what actually comes out. But anyway, so then in improving transcriptions, he suggests that all response tokens from the interviewer should be preserved, like that inner transcription should, and I was, I mean, I've been doing transcriptions and like, as an interviewer, I do this a lot. Yes. Yes, I can hear it in the and I'm like, am I gonna like stop every half line when somebody's like talking to put in yes. I don't think that, and again, I think this comes back to your research question and maybe your mode of analysis as well. If it's more of a conversation analysis type thing, then it's useful to have like to show that there was this encouragement from the interviewer all the way through, and this person just didn't just like monologue for 10 minutes, right? But at the same time, like if I'm talking about how somebody, if my paper is about how somebody's experienced healthcare, is it useful in the final product in the paper for the readers to see every time I said yes, yes, yes?
Yeah, I thought that he was talking more about capturing things like people's hesitations or pauses or like nervous giggles, that kind of thing. Okay. But also maybe where, if you're sitting there like nodding furiously and going, yes, yes, you're actually kind of driving them in a certain direction, whether you're aware of it or not.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think that's what he's saying we need to start engaging with. And he was talking about how often, typically, when we present and write up an article based on interviews, we just put in what the participants said. We don't actually put in what we said.
Yes.
And that comes back to that whole other discussion about this tension that qualitative researchers still fall into, of feeling that they need to be neutral. And so if one takes the other stance of saying, no, this is a subjective process, you are part of the meaning making as the interviewer, then it gives a very different stance.
I think my question is still like, to what extent does that, like, I agree that that's important, right? Just like, to what extent does it need to be kept into the final thing that
I hear you.
Paper, like,
if
it can't.
Yeah, it just becomes very cumbersome too, I think, if it's full of yes, yes,
exactly.
Yeah. Like, but as with conversation analysis, there is a decision that needs to be made about how much do you transcribe and how much detail do you put in. Yeah. So again, it does come back to the research question. I think you're right on that. Yeah. But also maybe more an awareness of how one's own interview style impacts on that person. And that's why I'm very excited for our study that we're going to do with Charmaine. So Siobhan had sent me an interview transcript and asked me to look at it. And didn't really give much guidance, just like, give me some thoughts. Is this on track? Yeah. And so I started analyzing in terms of your technique, but also how the person was responding. And what we thought is maybe that might make a nice paper, is to sit, and Charmaine's going to have a look at those as well. And then
so
see.
You and Charmaine have looked at, you've both given me comments on one. And with the exception of one thing that you both highlighted, which I thought was interesting, that you both highlighted that thing, your comments were actually very different. And I thought that was really interesting as well.
Absolutely.
Coming from like very different backgrounds. And I think like both of you have really relevant input, but just like very different input. Yeah. And
yeah, so that'll be an interesting topic going forward, because that study, I think, has also been tricky to navigate, also in terms of this concept of experience and fluidity, and over time, how you've had challenges with doing follow-up interviews, and how sometimes that's worked for certain participants and not for others. And so I think that the whole premise here and the point we need to take home is that one needs to be diving deeper and considering these kinds of things and thinking about and not taking for granted, oh, I just need to transcribe what the person said. No, actually, you need to consider a lot more than that, how it was said.
Could you consider non-verbals as well?
Absolutely.
I always think, because, if you ask someone something and they immediately their body language changes or they shift away,
Yes.
they're answering, but they won't make eye contact with you, or even sort of the pitch as well, I think makes a big difference, versus saying, yes, I agree, or for you. That makes a big difference, I think, and that should be noted.
And gestures as well. I mean, the famous example was Claire and I did a study years ago with grannies in Eldorado Park about genetic conditions in childhood and cultural beliefs and practices. And some of them were talking about infanticide, but didn't use that word. So they used a gesture. And so that was absolutely critical to note. So they were talking about how in the old days, children who were born with a condition used to just be quietly dealt with and killed. And so the gesture was absolutely crucial to note down. And that was not something that was recorded on the audio.
Yes.
So again, you've got to be so attuned to the gestures.
Can I just sorry. When you're done?
No.
Go, Charmaine.
Okay. I just, obviously from my limited experience, some of I think the responses are very valid. As you say, I think when you're saying and nodding, as you say, it's validating maybe what the person is saying, and it's almost encouraging them to continue. But one of the things I also found when I was interviewing, because when I listened to the interviews, at one of the hospitals, I was interviewing doctors about their experiences making decisions with patients. And the noise from outside and the door opening and closing and banging and excuse me and for me that was quite an important context, because one of the issues is there's no space, to have conversations with patients and the interruptions. So sometimes I think you're right, you have to sort of, I don't know, make a mental note or transcribe quickly and say, yes, at that point, this person did that, or, so sometimes, putting door opening, door closing, noise from outside, him singing in the background. I think sometimes those are also important to put into the transcription.
Absolutely. And even noting things like where the interview took place. So that interview might have been very different if it was done at a coffee shop or at some other private venue, quiet somewhere away.
Talk about this, which I like. I felt that was a bit of an omission in what he's talking about. Is that he doesn't. I mean, I come to it later, but he says something about the interview setup, and then he describes it as like what you've explained to the participant in terms of like what the interview is about. And I was like, but it's where the interview is, it's who's in the room,
it's the seating arrangement.
Yes.
I mean, it says this often we don't have that luxury where they like do it in a quiet, calm space.
Yes.
So there's no interruption.
And a couch.
You're in a filing room and there's nurses coming in and out to quickly get a file, and they're like,
absolutely,
sorry to bother, and like Charmaine says, the door's banging and there's it's not ideal.
And even with the door closed, you can hear all the noise from outside of people moving in and out.
And it's about 50 degrees, there's no window.
Yes.
So it's both about to faint.
You're not only like squatting into a tiny room and your knees are basically touching. I'm going to interview you. Would you sign this on your legs?
And I've only got 20 minutes because it's with a doctor who's got to see other patients. And it's very important.
Those points are important. They do impact your data.
Well, they frame the interview.
Yes.
Rona, I wanted to come back to you.
No, not at all. As much as I sometimes get frustrated with the CA detail, even in a response, there's a very big difference between saying yes, or yes. One is like, hurry up, get to the point. The other one is tell me more. And I think that would be missed if you going into if you're not getting the nuance of the transcription in terms of tone, pace, etc.
Like I have to say that's difficult to do. Like when for me transcribing when I'm the person who did the interview, because like it's like,
You know what you thought.
yes, it's
Yeah.
difficult to almost note like it's
What you did wrong.
it's only like later, if I look at the transcription later, like maybe weeks or months later, that I'm like, oh yeah, like I have no idea what tone that was. But when I'm listening to it, I'm like, oh yes, I know what tone that is. Yes, yes, yes. You know, like that it becomes almost difficult to note in a way. Like
Separate yourself.
yes, exactly.
Yeah, which is why I was just thinking with Charmaine's point as well, the importance of actually sitting and writing notes immediately after an interview, or having your own little debrief about that interview. You know, how did you find it? What stood out to you? And then making notes about the context, the setup, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, you can even do a recording. So I, after interviews with people just recently, would just quickly audio record on my phone my impressions, how I felt, how they were responding. Because sometimes you don't have time to write notes, but you can quickly just do a recording. I mean, obviously you have to do what works for you, but it does help to make those notes as soon as possible afterwards, because later you come back and think, oh gosh, I've forgotten that had happened. And yeah.
And what a valuable learning tool it is as an interviewer to see a transcript or to do a transcript of your interactions. I found it incredibly revealing in terms of my style, you know, and how time pressured I obviously feel, because, you know, I interrupt a whole lot more than I should, you know, so that was quite useful for me to know.
I think it's been a useful exercise for Siobhan as well too, and to get input. You know, it's quite something to put yourself out there for comments. It's a brave thing to do as well. But yeah, also what you were saying, Siobhan, just about the recording versus the transcript. I think that's so crucial as well, to remember that the data is actually the recording.
Yeah. But that's not what gets presented. Like when you're like making your argument in a paper, you don't have the recording, like, oh, listen to how the interviewer said this thing. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So anyway, his point is to analyze quotations within the interactional context of the interview, which I think we've all discussed quite a lot.
Yeah.
And then he talks about also with improving transcriptions, identity marker selection, and how when we as the researcher, we select certain identity markers, we say, okay, it's the participant is a woman, she's a mother, she's this age, she's got this job, she has this level of education, she's this race, she speaks this language. And he says that when we're doing this, we may be introducing a bias because there are so many identity markers that we could be choosing from, and we're choosing this specific selection, which I think is a good point. And he says when we're doing qualitative research, we can't actually reduce those markers to correlations. So they don't have a kind of statistical usefulness, and they may just introduce a bias in the reader. And this point, I think this first point here, I think this is really important, what he says about identity markers are only important when they're invoked by the participant themselves. And he uses the example of someone saying, as a mother, I feel blah, blah, blah. So then, you know, she's invoking her identity as a mother, and that it influenced her behavior or her experience in a specific way. And I think that's really important. I do think that identity markers can be really interesting, like from the perspective of like, sometimes it can be surprising. You know, I think that I've had that experience, like where you've got like, you know, for example, we interviewed a man who's like in his 70s, and he's like very energetic and very positive about the fact that he's taking care of his 40-year-old daughter who's dying. You know, like I think we don't really expect that of a 70-year-old man, right? And I think that sometimes it is a finding to look at those things in context and to say, like, that's not something that we expected of somebody with these specific identity markers. And he makes a suggestion then that we ignore what we already know about the participant, which I don't know if that's feasible. I don't know.
That's very hard to do.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Yes. I don't know that you can ignore it. I think that you can reflect on it. I think that reflexivity is more important. Like, how is this influencing how I see the participant? How is this influencing how I analyze the data? how is this influencing the relationship between us in the interview, right? Like we've been speaking about, but not that we can just ignore and pretend that we don't know these things about the person. I don't know.
Yeah, but I think what he's also saying is don't fall into the trap again of what journal editors and reviewers often demand is put in these kinds of identifiers, just slap them in, and then it looks pretty and it looks like you've done a thorough job. Well, actually, no, you're boxing people and you're not interrogating the identities that they invoke themselves.
Yes, or to present them when they come up, and maybe not only when they're invoked by the participant themselves, but when they come up as important in your analysis. Not just like, okay, here's the list of identity markers for this participant, and here's the list of identity markers for this participant, and they're all the same collection of identity markers, but rather like, this thing came up with this participant.
Yeah, it's the conversation has happened again.
It's the membership categorization.
It's an identity marker that is relevant to that person, and they've almost self-identified, or it's become relevant in that interview rather than you just assuming.
Yes.
So I suppose I don't think you can't arrive with a complete blank slate.
Exactly.
But I suppose he's saying sort of be open to other sort of more insight and more sort of understanding of different identity markers rather than you just assuming that is what they are.
And then again, looking at how they orient to it. Yeah.
Because I really liked that because it validated me, because I didn't collect race and gender demographics for my PhD. And one of the examiners came down quite hard on me about that. But and about cultural and linguistic variation and that. But within my research and within the questions that were asked, none of that arose or came or was relevant, or in the analysis, that's not what people identified with or showed their identity through race or culture or gender for this particular thing I was looking at. And so I really liked when he said that, because I was like, yes, we don't just have to quick box of I'm collecting all these specific things, but actually if something about those criteria or those identity markers that come out, then yes, reflect on it, but don't superimpose
your expectations.
Wow. Yeah. So I was really happy
able to rebut that one.
And then you could have put that varnished quote in as well, because that was like
yes, the varnish and pedestrian.
I know what kind of research you do.
But it's really nice, because it is because otherwise I sometimes feel like we reduce it to checkbox ticking.
Wow.
And this is really nice in saying, actually, what is the participant bringing, and what are their identity marks that they're bringing, not just that we superimpose. And I think we've got to find the balance between both.
Yes.
We collect, like you said, that it was a man from 14. Yes, all of that context matters, but we got to find the balance between
and is it relevant?
Yes.
And is it relevant to the question?
And not just, I think he says when it's invoked by the participant themselves, but I think also as the interviewer to say, oh, this was influencing how I was, perceiving this person, which for me happens, it happens in surprising ways. And like I've noticed, it's particularly with men, like it's almost like with women, I expect them to share and I expect them to be more open. And so when a man is like, sharing or crying or, or willing to even do that, I know we had a participant in the caregiver study where Sister Kileto interviewed him on both occasions because he did, his English was not good. So, and also he's a much older man. And it kind of seemed like more appropriate that she interviewed him. And the first interview, he was very reticent and he didn't share a lot. And I didn't expect at all that he would actually even be open to doing a second interview. But then he did, and then he shared much more. And I think that, it's like my preconception is and even from the first interview, my preconception is and talking about it with Sister Kileto. So he's this older man, he's got this idea of himself as he's a man, and he's looking after his wife, and he's not going to complain about it, and so he's not going to share this vulnerability. And in the first interview, it kind of comes across that way. But then he wanted to do a second interview, and he wanted to talk more about it. And there was, I think, maybe a development of a relationship with Kileto. And so those kind of presuppositions turned out to be not fully, reflective of who this person is and what their experience of the story is.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you go into an interview having chosen people using purposive sampling. So you've already boxed them to some extent.
Yeah.
This is someone in this category who has had this experience. But I guess what he's saying is put that aside and see how they orient to it and how it comes up, if it does come up in the interview.
But do you think there is this continuum as well? Because on that particular day, that first interview he didn't really know what to expect. He was maybe tempting the waters. He wasn't sure he'd never met Pellets. And then the second time around, he feels far more comfortable. And there's been that, like you said, it's been that development of rapport and trust. And he's like, okay, this is actually what this project's about. And actually, this is a space where I feel like I can share.
Yes.
So again, it's so hard because sometimes you only have an opportunity where you have one interview and that's all you're going to get. You're not going to have the opportunity or the luxury to meet that person again.
The second time, yeah.
And it can be a very different experience.
Yeah, I'm thinking I see Cynthia's on this meeting as well, and she had a slightly different experience, I think, with some of her participants who did a first interview and then said no thanks to a second one.
We've also had
and
that.
you've had that as well.
And also sometimes surprising, like with the one woman. I mean, I think the reason in her case, maybe but she's actually said this. The reason in her case is that like the patient, her mother has now died, and she said she doesn't feel comfortable like she's not ready emotionally to talk about it. But in the first interview, she was so forthcoming. She spoke so much. She seemed to find it really helpful to talk. And so I was quite surprised, even with the death of her mother, that she chose not to do another interview. I thought that she might find it helpful to talk about it. And she was like, no, she doesn't want to do that. Which again, I found a bit surprising. It's a very valuable woman who was sharing so much and so vulnerable and whatever, and it was like, no, I don't want to talk about it.
But it comes back to what we were saying earlier about experience being fluid and experience changing often quite rapidly over time. And experience really being linked to psychic state, if you want to call it that, or emotional state, where you're at, what's happening.
So just to go on with like his suggestions for improving the quality of interview data, he's then talking about the quality of interview analysis. And then this thing of describing interview setup, what he specifically referred to is like how you introduce the interview to the participant. But I think we've also discussed in a lot of detail the other aspects that are also important. I'm not going to go into that again. He says to include the actions of the interviewer. Again, like with an audio recording, sometimes it can be difficult to include all the actions. Obviously, you're including like, with your notes post interview, or but sometimes you're not always gonna. No, I know I use my hands a lot when I'm talking, and that's not going to be captured in an audio recording, and I'm not going to remember every action I did with my hands when I was talking to a person. So there are limitations. He says to link observations to interview elements, which I think is fairly obvious. Like if you're making an observation about an interview, it should be related to an element of the interview, surely.
But apparently not, given some of the examples he included, where people had really jumped to wild conclusions about their data.
And when he was giving those examples, I really think that's where he was also really trying to bring home about maybe what we sometimes as researchers we do is you think, I'm going to do an interview and it's quick and easy to get this information and then I can just interpret it. And I thought, because at the beginning of his article, I was a little bit like, it was quite like heavy to try and figure out where he was going with it. But when he brought those actual examples, then I was like, so that's why he was being so critical in the beginning, because actually look how people have jumped. And how am I doing that in the research that I do, in the interviews that I do, or when we're designing a study, just saying, we'll just interview because then that's the quickest and easiest way to get information and to prove our research aim. So I thought it was a really nice a way of illustrating to us how we have to be so careful about actually linking the observations and not just superimposing our own assumptions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a big indictment on the qualitative field because unfortunately there are too many people out there doing very superficial work, thinking that qualitative is the easier option.
I think of a mixed methods, they sort of spend such a huge portion, especially quantitative research. It's not everyone, but sort of they often say, oh no, we'll do a mixed method study, and they spend like 80-90% of the efforts in the quant data. And like, oh, we'll add some interviews.
Mm.
And you know,
Quant analysis is actually really quick.
and then and then they just say, well, just do mathematic analysis, and then they're like, oh, that's easy. We'll just put it into one of those like AI sort of things.
Yeah.
Data, and it's
Yeah.
it's really worrying.
Mm.
And maybe that's what he's also calling out.
Yeah.
And just making us be reflective, even though he didn't, I mean, it's 2016, because it's 2016, hey?
2015.
So he wasn't specifically targeting like, Atlas AI or any of these kind of things. But maybe it's also a subtle message or a thing to keep in mind, because these kind of things aren't considered.
Mm.
You use software like that unless you purposefully look at your software and then take these things.
Or like what
together.
are you using the software? I mean, like
They're there to be tools
Yeah,
to
yeah.
use, but
Not
not that
replacement.
they don't use
Yeah.
it, but just think about
Think about how you can bring them together.
Yeah.
I think you can like certainly with Charmaine and I, we use the software to like identify, like we make the identifications and we draw the conclusions. We use the software to,
Just thought and
exactly.
yeah.
Mm.
But not to draw conclusions, which is I think what ChatGPT or whatever can do now is like, oh, put it in and what's the conclusion,
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and again, reflexivity, he talks about thinking about the effects of our own assumptions and agendas. And something which I thought was really interesting was, also what is the participant's agenda in it? Because like, I feel like I know what my agenda is. But it's interesting to think about what is the agenda of the other person, and it may not always be what you think it is.
Oh, yes. I'm thinking of remember our study on why people enroll in clinical trials. So why do people enroll in interviews? It's not always altruistic.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was literally, I want to find a boyfriend or a girlfriend. I mean, that's, yes, in a clinical trial. They were looking for a girlfriend.
Wow. You got to ask what they were clinically trialing. It could be quite interesting.
It was a TB trial. I was like,
Yeah, I know. That is hilarious.
Field workers from the community to do the interviews, and they were sort of really young women.
Yes.
And they were sort of more interested in getting an opportunity to spend sort of 40 minutes with one of the young interviewers, and sort of at the end sort of say, can I have your number?
So I mean it's quite scary, but I think it's important to have that discussion, even in your own head, about why is this person signing up for this?
And it's weird because I actually hadn't thought of that at all. So that was something to I'm going to go quickly through the last things because we've only got a few minutes to go. But again, reflexivity on the effects of positionality, we've talked about that a lot. Analyzing the orientation of speakers to turns and transitions, that CA stuff, like how do people respond? Are they interrupting one another? And then he suggests we avoid cognitive individualist assumptions about someone's psychic state, which I've expressed my opinions about. And then again with analysis, if we come to an outcome about the interview data, to work backwards through the interview to see how that was constructed. I thought that was quite an interesting way to look at it. And then these appeals to perception. So like looking at, again, coming to the participant's agenda. What is the participant's agenda? And looking at sometimes they're saying things because they're appealing to your perception of them. And I thought that was really interesting and not something I thought about much. Like they want you to think of them, like for example, the old man I spoke about before, perhaps wants Keleto to think of him as like a good husband. I'm not complaining about my wife, and how those appeals to perception can influence what they're sharing and how they're sharing it.
Yeah, like the good mother.
Yeah.
That's come through in some of our pediatric interactions that we've recorded. Yeah.
And he makes a point as well, which I think is important, is that ordinary findings are just as relevant as exceptional findings. I feel like I do tend to note the exceptional things. So that was also important for me. He then talks about how some people may argue that this is irrelevant. And he says that this approach, the sociological approach that he's suggesting, can still inform practical intervention, and he uses this example of parents of children with heart defects and how they these like tragedy stories. But and you know, and how they then still had an intervention at the clinic to address that experience. So for me, I was like, it's still an experience. It's still, he's like, even if he's, you know, he's talking about it in sociological terms in that particular instance, that same example could be framed within the experiences of the participants. Yeah, so I guess for me, I'm still grappling with that part. But yeah, so in conclusion, I think one of the points he brings up is sociological processes versus experiential data. And he's arguing for more detailed transcriptions and more detailed analysis of the interactions that happen in an interview, and that can strengthen the data. But I think for me, what really came up is that those methodological aspects need to be relevant to the research question that we're trying to answer, that's really.
So always coming back to that question, what am I really doing here? What am I looking at? Yeah. Sonto?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yeah, so I think that's the impression that I also got at the end of this article. So as I was reading, I kept on saying that, but how is this, if this is not relevant to me, then is it really important that I pay attention to this aspect of the interview? I remember at some point I was like, but if you're really interested in this, then just do CA. But that's not what I'm doing. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I got. And I was just like, yeah, I think it just really depends on what you are trying to achieve. But the tips on how to improve the interview process, I think that was very useful. I was just reflecting on my own style of doing interviews, when maybe I'm talking to a participant and I think they've said enough and they've answered whatever research question that I had in mind, then I just like force them to quickly move on to the next question so as to not waste time. But yeah, I think it was a useful, yeah.
Yeah. And maybe actually spending more time and kind of allowing them that space to talk more if they want to. I mean, it's always interesting for me because do you let someone diverge off on a tangent, and maybe it's an important tangent, and maybe they talk about things that you didn't anticipate, or do you cut them off and kind of manage the time? I had a discussion yesterday with a fourth year who's prepping for focus groups, and she said to me, well, what do you do if they don't talk enough for the time that you've anticipated? So you've set an hour for the focus group. What if they don't talk enough, or what if they talk too much? And I said to her, but it depends on the people involved. You can't predict necessarily. You've just got to kind of go with it. That some people will give you lots of information and some people won't. So yeah, tricky to manage that, Sonto. That's an interesting point.
I think I see Cynthia.
Cynthia, do you want to jump in here?
Thanks, Jenny. Just picking up on your the comment that you just made now. One of my fourth years, interestingly, when she was conducting she's conducting interviews with caregivers of children with gastrostomy tubes and finding out if they're satisfied. So when she started the interview, the caregiver said, you know what, I actually need to give you the background story for you to understand what happened. And I think sometimes, which took up maybe, let's just say 15 minutes of that, because she said, I can't just tell you whether I'm satisfied or not until you understand how we got here and even my level of involvement. So I guess it really depends on, what they're saying. So you can't really say, no, don't share, or I don't know. So I feel sometimes
I don't want to hear that.
I don't want to hear that. But sometimes I find that it is, even for me, one of my participants, if she didn't tell me the issues that she had or the journey of becoming a mom and then becoming a mom with a child who's then diagnosed with CP, I think I wouldn't really understand her entire experiences, because then I got to understand that she's not only grappling with being a mom of a child with CP, but also just this relationship ending. and navigating, you know, relationship drama that was happening in her life at that moment.
Sure.
So I guess it just depends. And when do you, but also then I find myself asking now, when you were talking, that, but when do you say to them, okay, thanks? Because with that particular participant, we did 3 interviews and each was sometimes like an hour long, because she's just talking, you know, a lot, but not to say nothing. Everything she was saying was very valuable because it just gave me an insight into who she is. So I guess it's hard to navigate. I think that's what I'm also taking about. It's hard to navigate, and I think it depends on the participant.
Absolutely. Thanks, Cynthia, for that. Yeah.
So, I had the question myself of like, had I missed the author's point? And I think like having this discussion with everybody and getting other people's like insights into reading it, the article has been really useful for me as well. Like to hear different people's perspectives and thoughts, and it's kind of clarified more of like, I think it does come back, like Sonto was saying, is this relevant to me? Like, am I using this? And I think taking the bits away and saying like, these bits are relevant to my research question, and these bits are maybe less relevant to me right now for this project. I think that's a fair thing to do.
Yeah, no easy answers here. I mean, the more we learn about qualitative research, the more we understand how difficult and complex it is, I guess. Yeah. So thank you, Siobhan. This has been such an interesting discussion. I really loved how you put the little bubbles with your own thoughts and responses. It's a lovely way of doing things, and kind of prompting discussion around that. So well done, and thank you. Thanks, everybody. We've run out of time, and as usual, we could talk for a whole nother hour. But we look forward to meeting again next month, and we'll pick another juicy topic. This has been great. So thanks, and have a good rest of the day. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.